I married you for your inheritance. And now that I have access to everything, I don't need to pretend anymore." Those words shattered my world on what should have been the most romantic evening of my honeymoon in Santorini. What my husband Marcus didn't know was that Grandpa's will contained a clause that would change everything, and his confession had just activated it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The azure waters of the Aegean Sea stretched endlessly before our private villa's terrace, but the breathtaking sunset might as well have been painted on cardboard for all the beauty I could perceive in that moment. Marcus stood with his back to me, his champagne glass catching the golden light as he delivered the words that would reshape my entire understanding of our relationship. We had been married for exactly 72 hours. The wedding in Napa Valley had been everything I had dreamed of since childhood. Elegant, intimate, and surrounded by family and friends who had watched our 2-year courtship with approval and joy. The ceremony had taken place at Chateau Montelena, the same vineyard where my late grandfather had proposed to my grandmother 60 years earlier. The symbolism had felt perfect then, a continuation of family legacy and enduring love. Marcus Alexander Thornfield had swept into my life like a character from a romance novel. Tall, handsome, with the kind of confident smile that made servers in restaurants remember his name and baristas write heart shapes in his coffee foam. He worked as a commercial real estate developer, spoke fluent French and Italian, and had the sort of cultured background that impressed my mother's bridge club friends. When he proposed beneath the cherry blossoms in Golden Gate Park, I had felt like the luckiest woman alive. The irony was not lost on me that my grandfather's legacy had brought us together in more ways than one. Marcus had initially encountered me at a charity gala for the Whitmore Foundation, the philanthropic organization my grandfather had established 50 years earlier. I served on the board as a family representative, continuing the work that had defined much of my grandfather's later life. The foundation focused on educational initiatives for underprivileged youth, providing scholarships and mentorship programs that had helped thousands of young people achieve their dreams. That evening at the Francis Hotel, Marcus had approached me during the silent auction, commenting on a painting by a local artist that we were both admiring. His knowledge of art history was impressive, and our conversation had flowed effortlessly from Renaissance masters to contemporary installation. He had bid on the painting and won, then surprised me by suggesting we visit the artist's studio together the following weekend. The courtship that followed had been methodical in its perfection. Marcus seemed to understand instinctively what would appeal to me: quiet dinners at intimate restaurants, weekend trips to Carmel and Mendocino, tickets to the symphony and art gallery openings. He listened when I spoke about my work at the foundation, asked thoughtful questions about my grandfather's legacy, and expressed genuine admiration for my commitment to continuing his philanthropic vision. My friends had been unanimously supportive of the relationship. Sarah, my college roommate who had become a successful attorney, had pronounced him absolutely perfect after meeting him at a dinner party. My cousin Jennifer, who worked in fashion and had a reputation for being impossibly picky about men, had texted me after our first double date. "Marry him before someone else does." Even my usually skeptical mother had warmed to Marcus quickly, commenting on his excellent manners and obvious devotion to me. The engagement had been a 6-month whirlwind of planning and preparation. Marcus had been wonderfully supportive throughout the process, offering opinions when asked but never attempting to control decisions that were clearly mine to make. He had even suggested that we write our own vows, a romantic gesture that had moved me to tears when he proposed the idea. His vows, delivered in his confident baritone voice before our assembled loved ones, had spoken of partnership, devotion, and building a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. The wedding gifts had been generous, reflecting both our family's social circles and the genuine affection our friends felt for our union. Crystal from Tiffany, art from local galleries, and enough kitchen equipment to stock a small restaurant. But the most significant gift had been the envelope my grandfather's attorney had handed me privately before the ceremony, containing documents that would not be relevant until after the marriage was legally complete. My grandfather, Robert Whitmore, had been one of San Francisco's most successful real estate developers, building his fortune through careful investments and an uncanny ability to identify neighborhoods before they became fashionable. He had developed much of what was now Soma, purchased vineyard land in Napa before wine country became internationally recognized, and owned commercial properties throughout the Bay Area. His passing 2 years earlier had left a void in my life that I was still learning to navigate. The will reading had been conducted with the formal precision that characterized all of my grandfather's business dealings. The bulk of his estate, valued at approximately $47 million, had been placed in a trust with specific provisions for distribution. The Whitmore Foundation would receive $20 million to ensure its continued operation. Various family members and longtime employees would receive generous individual bequests. The remainder, including the family home in Pacific Heights and the vineyard property in Napa, would come to me. However, my grandfather's attorney had explained that there were certain conditions attached to my inheritance. The language had been complex, filled with legal terminology that I had not fully understood at the time. The essential point seemed to be that the inheritance would be managed through the trust until I reached certain life milestones, with marriage being the primary trigger for full access to the funds. What I had not realized, in the excitement of wedding planning and the joy of beginning married life, was that there were additional provisions in the will that would only become relevant under specific circumstances. My grandfather had been a shrewd judge of character, and his legal documents reflected a lifetime of experience in protecting his interests and those of his loved ones. The honeymoon in Santorini had been Marcus's suggestion, though I had enthusiastically embraced the idea. The island's dramatic landscape and romantic atmosphere seemed perfect for beginning our married life. We had reserved the presidential suite at the Andronis Luxury Suites, with its infinity pool overlooking the caldera and private terrace, where we could watch the sunset each evening. The first 2 days had been idyllic. We had explored the narrow streets of Oaya, visited local wineries, and spent long hours on the black sand beaches. Marcus had been attentive and affectionate, taking photographs of me against the dramatic backdrop of whitewashed buildings and blue-domed churches. In the evenings, we had dined at restaurants perched on clifftops, sharing plates of fresh seafood and local wines, while making plans for our future together. On our third evening, as we prepared for dinner at one of the island's most exclusive restaurants, Marcus had suggested that we have champagne on the terrace first. The gesture had seemed romantic and perfectly in character with his thoughtful nature. He had opened a bottle of Dom Perignon, filled our glasses, and proposed a toast to our future together. But then, as the sun began to set and the sky turned the brilliant orange and pink that made Santorini famous, Marcus had turned away from me to face the water. His posture had changed, his shoulders relaxing in a way that suggested he was about to share something significant. When he spoke, his voice carried a different tone than I had heard before, not the warm, engaging cadence that had characterized our courtship, but something harder and more calculating. "You know, Elena," he had said, using the formal version of my name rather than the Ellie that everyone who knew me well preferred, "I think it's time we were honest with each other about what this marriage really means." The words had sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. I had set down my champagne glass and waited for him to continue, though some instinct had already begun to warn me that whatever he was about to say would change everything between us. "I've been thinking about this for months," Marcus had continued, still facing away from me. "The pretense is exhausting, and now that we're legally married, there's really no point in continuing the charade." The casual cruelty of his words had been like a physical blow. I had opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but he had continued speaking before I could form the question. "I married you for your inheritance, and now that I have access to everything, I don't need to pretend anymore." The silence that followed had been filled with the sound of waves against the rocks below, and the distant laughter of other tourists enjoying their evening. I had stood frozen on the terrace, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. This was the man who had written beautiful vows about partnership and devotion, who had spent 2 years appearing to fall in love with me, who had been welcomed into my family as a beloved son-in-law. "Marcus," I had whispered, my voice barely audible above the evening sounds, "what are you saying?" He had turned then, and the expression on his face had been that of a stranger. The warmth and affection that I had grown to love were completely absent, replaced by something cold and calculating. It was as if he had removed a mask that he had been wearing for our entire relationship. "I'm saying that the performance is over," he had replied with a shrug. "You're a nice enough person, Elena, But let's be realistic. I'm 34 years old and I've been working in commercial real estate for a decade. I'm successful, but I'm not wealthy. Your grandfather's inheritance changes everything. The words had hit me like a series of physical blows. Every romantic gesture, every thoughtful conversation, every moment of apparent intimacy had been calculated manipulation. The man I had married was not the man I had fallen in love with, because that man had never existed. The timing worked out perfectly, Marcus had continued, seeming to take pleasure in my obvious Your grandfather's death created an opportunity, and I positioned myself to take advantage of it. The charity gala was easy enough to research and attend. Once I understood your role in the foundation and your inheritance situation, everything else was just a matter of execution. I had sunk into one of the terrace chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The magnitude of his deception was overwhelming. Every memory of our courtship was now tainted by the knowledge that it had been an elaborate performance designed to manipulate me into marriage. You researched, I had asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Of course, Marcus had replied matter-of-factly. Your grandfather was a prominent figure in San Francisco business circles. The details of his estate were hardly secret among people who pay attention to such things. The foundation's annual reports are public documents. Your social media presence provided plenty of information about your interests and personality. The clinical way he described his manipulation was perhaps worse than the deception itself. I had been reduced to a target, a mark to be studied and exploited for financial gain. The love I had felt for him, the trust I had placed in him, the dreams we had shared about our future together, all of it had been built on lies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The inheritance was always the goal, Marcus had concluded, taking a sip of his champagne, as if we were discussing the weather. Everything else was just the means to that end. As I sat there on the terrace, watching the man I had married destroy the foundation of our relationship with casual indifference, I felt something begin to shift inside me. The initial shock and pain were giving way to something else, a cold, clear anger that seemed to sharpen my thinking rather than cloud it. What Marcus did not know, could not have known despite all his research and planning, was that my grandfather had been just as skilled at reading people as Marcus believed himself to be. The will that Marcus thought guaranteed him access to my inheritance contained provisions that he had never imagined, protections that my grandfather had put in place precisely to guard against the kind of manipulation that was now being revealed. The conversation that had just occurred on our honeymoon terrace was about to activate those protections in ways that would transform both our lives, though not in the way that Marcus expected. The remainder of that evening passed in a surreal haze of forced normalcy. Marcus had concluded his devastating revelation with a casual suggestion that we proceed to dinner as planned, as if he had merely commented on the weather rather than destroyed the foundation of our marriage. His ability to compartmentalize his cruelty was perhaps more chilling than the confession itself. I had somehow managed to get through the meal at Celine Restaurant, mechanically consuming the award-winning cuisine while Marcus chatted amiably with the sommelier about wine pairing. To any observer, we would have appeared to be the perfect honeymooning couple, attractive, well-dressed, and comfortably affluent. The reality was that I was sitting across from a stranger who had methodically deceived me for 2 years to gain access to my family's wealth. That night, as Marcus slept peacefully beside me in our luxury suite, I stared at the ceiling and processed the magnitude of what had been revealed. The man I had married was not merely unfaithful or dishonest. He was a calculating manipulator who had orchestrated an elaborate long-term deception for financial gain. Every moment of our relationship had been contaminated by his hidden agenda. But as the shock began to wear off, I found myself remembering something my grandfather had told me during one of our last conversations before his death. We had been walking through his vineyard in Napa discussing the challenges of protecting wealth across generations, when he had shared a story about a business partner who had attempted to defraud him in the most dangerous people, Elena, he had said, using the formal version of my name that Marcus had adopted, are those who appear to be exactly what you need them to be. They study you, learn your weaknesses, and present themselves as the perfect solution to your problem. But authentic relationships are built on mutual vulnerability, not calculated performance. At the time, I had interpreted his words as general wisdom about business relationships. Now I understood that they had been specific guidance about personal relationships as well, and possibly a warning about the very situation I was now facing. The morning after Marcus's revelation, I excused myself from breakfast and made a phone call to my grandfather's attorney, Harrison Blake, at his San Francisco office. The time difference meant that it was still early evening in California, and Harrison was working late as he typically did. "Elena, how wonderful to hear from you," Harrison said warmly. "How is the honeymoon? Are you enjoying Santorini?" "Harrison, I need to ask you about something in grandfather's will," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You mentioned that there were provisions that would only become relevant under specific circumstances. What exactly did you mean?" There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Harrison had been my grandfather's attorney for over 30 years, and had helped structure many of his most important business deals. If anyone understood the full implications of the will's language, it would be him. "Elena, are you somewhere where you can speak privately?" Harrison asked, his tone becoming more serious. "Yes, I'm alone. Your grandfather included several protective clauses in the will that were designed to activate under certain conditions. The most significant one relates to what he called predatory marriage, situations where someone might marry you primarily for financial gain, rather than genuine affection. The will includes a provision that if your husband ever explicitly states that he married you for your inheritance, or if there is clear evidence that the marriage was primarily motivated by financial considerations, the inheritance structure changes dramatically." I gripped the phone tight. "How does it change?" "Instead of the funds being accessible to both you and your husband as marital assets, they would be placed in a separate trust that only you can access. Additionally, there would be a mandatory waiting period of 1 year before any funds could be distributed, during which time your husband would have no legal claim to any portion of the inheritance." The implications of what Harrison was telling me began to sink in. My grandfather had somehow anticipated the exact scenario that had just unfolded and had taken steps to protect me from it. But how would such a provision be enforced? I asked, how would anyone know if my husband made such a statement? "Your grandfather was quite thorough in his planning," Harrison replied. "The will includes a clause requiring that you inform my office immediately if such a situation arises. Once you provide that notification, the protective provisions activate automatically. And if I were to provide such notification now, then your husband would discover that his access to your inheritance is far more limited than he assumed. The funds would be placed in the protective trust, and any assets he believed he could access would be frozen pending a full legal review of the marriage's circumstances." I felt a surge of gratitude toward my grandfather that was so intense it brought tears to my eyes. Even from beyond the grave, he was still protecting me from those who would take advantage of my trust and affection. "Harrison, I need to officially notify you that my husband admitted to me yesterday that he married me for my inheritance." The silence that followed was profound. When Harrison spoke again, his voice carried a mixture of sadness and determination. "Elena, I am deeply sorry that this has happened, but I want you to know that your grandfather anticipated this possibility and took extensive measures to protect you. The protective provisions are now in effect immediately. What happens next? I will need you to provide a detailed written statement about what your husband told you and the circumstances surrounding his admission. This will be used to document the activation of the protective clause. Additionally, I will begin the process of restructuring the inheritance, according to the alternative provisions your grandfather specified." As Harrison explained the legal procedures that would follow, I felt a transformation beginning within. The devastation and betrayal I had felt the night before were being replaced by something else, a sense of empowerment and control that I had not expected. My grandfather's foresight had given me options that Marcus could never have imagined. While he believed that his confession had secured his access to my inheritance, he had actually triggered provisions that would cut him off from it entirely. But more than the financial protection, I realized that my grandfather's planning had given me something even more valuable: time and space to make decisions about my future from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. After completing the call with Harrison, I spent the remainder of the morning on the villa's terrace, thinking about the broader implications of what I had learned. Marcus's deception was not just a personal betrayal, it was a systematic fraud that had been executed with careful planning and deliberate manipulation. The man I had married was not merely dishonest, he was dangerous. His ability to maintain such an elaborate deception for 2 years demonstrated a level of psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple greed. He had studied me, learned my vulnerabilities, and crafted a persona specifically designed to exploit my emotions and gain my trust. But his confession had also revealed a crucial weakness in his approach. Marcus had assumed that marriage would give him automatic access to my inheritance, without fully understanding the legal structures that governed its distribution. His overconfidence in his own cleverness had led him to reveal his true intentions prematurely. When Marcus returned from his morning swim, he found me reading on the terrace, apparently calm and composed. He seemed pleased by my apparent acceptance of his revelation, interpreting my quiet demeanor as submission to his control. "I'm glad we had that conversation last night," he said, toweling off his hair. "I think we'll both be happier now that we can be honest with each other." I looked up from my book, a biography of successful women entrepreneurs that I had brought for vacation reading, and studied his face. The mask of affection was completely gone, replaced by a casual arrogance that was both revealing and repugnant. "I agree," I replied even. "Honesty is definitely important in a marriage." Marcus smiled, apparently satisfied that I had accepted my role in his scheme. "Exactly, and now that we understand each other, we can focus on enjoying your grandfather's legacy together." The possessive way he referred to my inheritance was illuminating. In his mind, our marriage had transformed my family's wealth into his personal asset. He had no understanding of the legal complexities involved, or the protections that had been put in place specifically to prevent such exploitation. "I've been thinking about what you said," I continued, maintaining my calm tone, "about your research into my background and the inheritance situation. It must have taken considerable effort to plan everything so carefully." Marcus's expression showed a flicker of pride. "It was quite a project," he admitted, "but the potential return on investment made it worthwhile. Your grandfather's estate is substantial enough to provide security for several lifetimes." The casual way he discussed his manipulation was chilling. I was not a person to him, I was an investment opportunity that had required careful cultivation to reach maturity. "I'm curious," I said, closing my book and giving him my full attention. "What made you confident that marriage would give you access to the inheritance? Did you research the legal structure of the estate?" Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "California is a community property state. Once we're married, your assets become our assets. It's basic law." His oversimplification of the legal situation was breathtaking. He had apparently assumed that marriage would automatically entitle him to half of my inheritance, without considering the possibility that such a substantial estate would be protected by sophisticated legal structures. "Did you consult with an attorney about the specifics?" I didn't need to," Marcus replied confidently. "The basic principle is straightforward enough. Besides, your grandfather's attorney explained the inheritance process to you in fairly simple terms. Once you're married, the funds become accessible to both of." His misunderstanding of the situation was so complete that I almost felt sorry for him. He had built his entire scheme on assumptions about legal processes that were fundamentally incorrect. "That's interesting," I said neutrally. I had wondered about some of the details myself. Marcus settled into the chair beside me, apparently pleased to discuss his successful manipulation. "The key was timing," he said. "I needed to establish the relationship before your grandfather's death, so that our marriage would seem natural rather than opportunistic. 2 years was exactly the right amount of time to build trust and affection without arousing suspicion." The methodical way he described his deception was both horrifying and fascinating. He had treated our relationship like a business project, with timelines, objectives, and measurable outcomes. "And you never worried that I might discover your true intentions?" I asked. Marcus laughed, a sound that contained no warmth. "Why would you? You wanted to believe that someone like me could genuinely fall in love with someone like you. People see what they want to see, especially when it comes to romance." His casual cruelty was stunning. Not only had he deceived me, but he had also convinced himself that I was somehow pathetic for believing in his performance.
In his mind, I was a naive victim, who had deserved to be manipulated because of my willingness to trust. "You're probably right," I said quietly. "People do tend to see what they want to see." Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied with my acceptance of his assessment. "Exactly. And now that we're past all the pretense, we can focus on more practical matters. I've been thinking about some investment opportunities that might be appropriate for our new financial situation." The speed with which he had transitioned from revealing his deception to planning how to spend my inheritance was remarkable. In his mind, his confession had been a minor inconvenience that cleared the way for more important business. "What kind of investment?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far his presumption extended. "Real estate development projects, primarily. I have contacts in the industry who have been looking for private investors. With your grandfather's capital, we could participate in some very lucrative opportunity." I nodded as if considering his suggestions, while internally marveling at his complete misunderstanding of the situation. He was making plans to invest money that he would never have access to, in partnerships that would never materialize, based on assumptions about legal structures that were entirely incorrect. "That sounds like something we should discuss with Harrison Blake." He's been managing the estate's legal affairs, and he would need to be involved in any major investment decisions. Marcus's expression showed a moment of uncertainty. "I'm not sure we need to involve attorneys in every decision. They tend to complicate things unnecessarily." "Actually, I think it would be wise to consult with him," I replied, "especially given the complexity of the inheritance structure. I wouldn't want to make any mistakes that could jeopardize our access to the funds." The word "our" seemed to reassure Marcus, and he nodded approving. "You're right to be cautious. We should definitely make sure we understand all the legal requirements before making any major moves." As we continued to discuss his plans for my inheritance, I found myself studying him with new eyes. This was a man who had spent 2 years creating an elaborate fiction to deceive me, yet he had failed to conduct even basic research into the legal structures that governed the very wealth he was trying to access. His overconfidence had been his downfall. He had assumed that his ability to manipulate me personally would be sufficient to achieve his financial goals, without considering that my grandfather might have anticipated such manipulation and taken steps to prevent it. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand that Marcus's confession had given me more than just painful knowledge about his true character. It had also provided me with a strategic advantage that he could not have imagined. While he believed that his honesty had secured his position, he had actually triggered legal protections that would ultimately ensure his failure. The remainder of our honeymoon would be an exercise in careful observation and strategic planning. I would need to document his continuing admissions about his motivations, while preparing for the legal and financial consequences of his deception. But most importantly, I would need to prepare myself for the personal transformation that would be required to move forward from this betrayal. The woman who had been deceived by Marcus's performance would need to become someone stronger, more cautious, and more strategic in her approach to relationships and trust. My grandfather's foresight had protected my inheritance, but it would be up to me to protect my future.
The following morning brought a clarity of thought that I had not experienced since Marcus's devastating revelation. As I sat on the villa's terrace with my coffee, watching the early morning light transform the Aegean Sea from deep blue to brilliant turquoise, I found myself analyzing the psychological mechanics of what had been done to me, with the detached precision of a researcher studying a complex phenomenon. The manipulation I had experienced was not merely the result of one person's greed or dishonesty. It represented a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that Marcus had employed with calculated precision. His success in deceiving me for 2 years had required not just acting ability, but a deep comprehension of how trust is built, maintained, and exploited in intimate relationships. The first element of his deception had been what psychologists call mirroring, the practice of reflecting back to someone the qualities and interests they find most appealing. Marcus had not simply pretended to love me, he had methodically crafted a persona that would be irresistible to someone with my specific background, values, and emotional needs. His knowledge of art history, which had so impressed me during our first conversation at the charity gala, had been acquired through focused study rather than genuine interest. I remembered now how he had steered our early conversations toward topics where he could demonstrate this knowledge while gathering information about my own preferences and opinions. Each subsequent interaction had been designed to reinforce his image as someone who shared my intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication. The attention he had paid to my work with the Whitmore Foundation had been particularly insidious. His questions about my grandfather's philanthropic legacy had seemed like genuine interest in my family's values and my own commitment to social responsibility. In reality, he had been conducting market research, gathering intelligence about the source and scope of my inheritance, while positioning himself as someone who appreciated and supported my charitable work. Even his proposal location had been calculated for maximum emotional impact. Cherry blossom season in Golden Gate Park was not a romantic whim, but a strategic choice based on observations about my social media posts and comments about spring being my favorite season. The timing had been carefully planned to coincide with a moment when I would be most receptive to his declaration of love and commitment. The psychological sophistication of his approach was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Marcus had understood that successful long-term deception required more than surface-level performance. He had needed to create genuine emotional responses in me, to make me feel seen, valued, and understood in ways that would overcome my natural skepticism and defensive instinct. This understanding led me to a painful but important realization about my own vulnerabilities. Marcus had succeeded in his deception, not just because he was skilled at manipulation, but because he had identified and exploited specific emotional needs that I had not even fully recognized in myself. As the only child of successful but often absent parents, I had grown up with significant material advantages but limited emotional intimacy. My father's demanding career as a federal judge and my mother's extensive involvement in social and charitable organizations had provided me with excellent educational opportunities and exposure to cultured society, but had left me with an unconscious hunger for personal attention and validation. Marcus had recognized this vulnerability and had fed it systematically throughout our courtship. His focused attention during our conversations, his apparent fascination with my thoughts and opinions, and his consistent prioritization of time with me over other commitments had filled an emotional void that I had not even realized existed. The irony was profound. In my work with the Whitmore Foundation, I had developed considerable expertise in identifying and addressing the unmet needs of disadvantaged youth. I could recognize the signs of emotional neglect in scholarship applicants, and had helped design mentorship programs that provided the guidance and support these young people needed to succeed. Yet I had been completely blind to my own similar needs, and the ways they could be exploited by someone with malicious intent. This recognition was both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it forced me to acknowledge that my intelligence and education had not protected me from manipulation. Empowering because it provided insight into the psychological mechanisms that had been used against me, knowledge that could help me recognize and resist similar tactics in the future. The second major element of Marcus's deception had been what experts call intermittent reinforcement, the practice of providing rewards and validation on an unpredictable schedule that actually strengthens attachment and dependence. His attention and affection had not been constant, but had been carefully calibrated to create maximum emotional impact. During our courtship, Marcus had alternated between periods of intense focus on me and strategic absences that left me wondering about his feelings and eager for his return. Weekend trips would be followed by busy work periods where he was less available for communication. Romantic gestures would be spaced out just enough to feel special and meaningful rather than routine or expected. This pattern had created a psychological dynamic where I had become increasingly invested in earning and maintaining his attention. Rather than taking his affection for granted, I had worked to deserve it, constantly evaluating my own behavior and adjusting my responses to maintain his interest and approval. The wedding planning process had been particularly revealing in retrospect. Marcus had participated in it enthusiastically, but had also created subtle pressure around certain decisions through his pattern of approval and withdrawal. His excitement about the Napa Valley venue had influenced my choice of location. His comments about preferring intimate gatherings had shaped my decisions about the guest list. At the time, I had interpreted these influences as natural compromise and mutual consideration. Now I understood them as sophisticated manipulation techniques, designed to ensure that our wedding would serve his purposes, while maintaining my belief that I was making autonomous choices about my own life. The third element of his deception had been the careful management of social proof and external validation. Marcus had understood that my feelings about our relationship would be significantly influenced by how others perceived him and our compatibility. He had therefore invested considerable effort in managing his image within my social circle and family. His charming interactions with my friends had been calculated performances designed to generate positive feedback that would reinforce my attachment to him. His respectful behavior toward my parents had been strategic positioning to eliminate potential sources of skepticism or opposition to our relationship. Most significantly, his apparent devotion to me in public settings had created a feedback loop where my own feelings were reinforced by others' observations of his behavior. When friends commented on how lucky I was to have found someone so obviously devoted to me, their words had strengthened my emotional investment in the relationship and my resistance to any doubts or concerns. The wedding itself had been the culmination of this social validation process. The presence of family and friends who had witnessed our courtship and approved of our union had created a powerful psychological pressure to maintain belief in the relationship's authenticity. The public commitment ceremony had made questioning the relationship's foundation emotionally and socially costly. Marcus had understood that people are more likely to maintain beliefs and commitments that have been publicly declared and socially validated. By creating circumstances where I had announced my love and commitment to him in front of everyone I cared about, he had made it psychologically difficult for me to later question the relationship's legitimacy. The fourth element of his deception had been the strategic use of what psychologists call commitment escalation. The practice of gradually increasing the stakes of a relationship in ways that make withdrawal increasingly difficult. Each step in our courtship had been designed to deepen my investment and raise the cost of ending the relationship. The progression from casual dating to exclusive relationship to living together to engagement to marriage had been carefully paced to allow me to adjust each new level of commitment while building momentum toward the ultimate goal of legal marriage. Each transition had been presented as a natural evolution of our deepening feelings rather than strategic moves toward a predetermined objective. The timing of his proposal had been particularly well calculated. It had come at a moment when I was emotionally vulnerable following a difficult period at work and personally ready for the security and validation that marriage represented. His timing had taken advantage of my emotional state while appearing to be a spontaneous expression of his love. The engagement period had been designed to maximize my investment in the relationship while minimizing opportunities for reflection or second-guessing. The busy schedule of wedding planning had kept me focused on logistics rather than relationship analysis. The excitement of friends and family had created social pressure to maintain enthusiasm and avoid doubt. By the time I might have been naturally inclined to step back and evaluate the relationship objectively, I had already made significant financial, emotional, and social investments in our future together. The cost of ending the relationship had grown with each passing month, making it increasingly difficult to consider that option even if concerns had arisen. The psychological sophistication of Marcus's approach was both impressive and terrifying. He had not simply lied to me about his feelings or intentions. He had created a comprehensive system of emotional manipulation that had made me complicit in my own deception. By the time of our wedding, I had become emotionally dependent on a version of him that had never existed. This understanding was crucial for my recovery and future protection. The shame and self-blame I had initially felt about being deceived were inappropriate responses to what had been a sophisticated psychological attack. Marcus's success had not been due to my naivety or stupidity, but to his systematic exploitation of normal human needs for connection, validation, and security. The motivational implications of this analysis were profound. If I could understand how I had been manipulated, I could learn to recognize similar tactics in the future and develop better strategies for protecting myself. More importantly, I could help others who might be vulnerable to similar deception, by sharing what I had learned about the psychology of relationship manipulation. My grandfather's protective provisions had given me financial security, but my understanding of Marcus's psychological tactics would provide me with something equally valuable: the knowledge and skills necessary to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than manipulation and exploitation. The woman who had been deceived by Marcus's performance would need to become someone who could recognize the difference between genuine affection and calculated manipulation, between authentic compatibility and strategic mirroring, between natural relationship progression and systematic commitment escalation. This transformation would require not just intellectual understanding, but emotional healing and personal growth. I would need to develop a clearer sense of my own needs and vulnerabilities, better boundaries in relationships, and more sophisticated evaluation skills for assessing potential partners. The journey ahead would be challenging, but I was beginning to understand that Marcus's betrayal had provided me with an unexpected opportunity for personal development. The painful lessons I was learning about manipulation and deception would ultimately make me stronger, more self-aware, and better equipped to build healthy relationships in the future. As I finished my coffee and prepared to face another day of maintaining the facade of honeymoon happiness while secretly planning my response to Marcus's deception, I felt a growing sense of determination. The psychological weapons he had used against me were now becoming tools for my own empowerment and protection. The fourth day of our honeymoon marked a fundamental shift in my approach to the situation. Rather than remaining paralyzed by the emotional devastation of Marcus's betrayal, I began to treat my circumstances as a complex problem requiring systematic analysis and strategic response. This transformation in mindset represented the first crucial step in reclaiming control over my life and future. The villa's private office became my command center for this assessment. While Marcus spent his morning at the resort spa apparently confident that his confession had secured his position, I spread out the documents I had brought with me and began conducting a comprehensive review of my assets, legal protections, and available options. The financial picture was more complex than I had initially understood. My grandfather's estate planning had been extraordinarily sophisticated, involving multiple trusts, offshore accounts, and investment vehicles that provided both growth potential and asset protection. The inheritance I would receive was not simply a lump sum but a carefully structured portfolio, designed to generate substantial income while preserving capital for future generations. Harrison Blake had emailed me detailed documentation overnight, outlining the specific provisions that had been activated by Marcus's confession. The protective clauses my grandfather had included were even more comprehensive than I had realized during our initial phone conversation. They covered not only situations where my husband explicitly admitted to marrying me for financial gain, but also circumstances where his behavior demonstrated a pattern of exploitation or manipulation. The legal framework provided me with several strategic options. The most immediate was the complete separation of my inheritance from any potential community property claims. Marcus would have no legal access to the funds, regardless of California's community property law. Additionally, the trust structure included provisions for legal fees and other expenses associated with protecting the assets from fraudulent claims. More significantly, the will included what my grandfather had termed consequence provisions, financial penalties that would be imposed on anyone who attempted to defraud me or manipulate me for financial gain. These provisions were designed to ensure that such behavior would result in significant personal cost to the perpetrator, creating a powerful deterrent effect. The investigation protocols my grandfather had established were particularly thorough. Upon activation of the protective clauses, a team of forensic accountants and private investigators would be engaged to conduct a comprehensive review of Marcus's financial situation, background, and activities during our courtship. This investigation would determine whether additional legal action was warranted and would provide evidence for any potential criminal or civil proceedings. The emotional impact of discovering these protections was profound. My grandfather had not simply provided me with wealth,
he had given me a comprehensive system for defending myself against exploitation. His understanding of the challenges I might face as a young woman inheriting substantial assets had led him to create protections that were both practical and empowering. But the financial and legal protections were only part of the strategic picture. I needed to understand Marcus's position and motivations more completely to develop an effective response plan. His confession had revealed his ultimate objective, but I still needed to assess his capabilities, resources, and likely reactions to the obstacles he was about to encounter. The research capabilities available to me were extensive. The private investigation firm that my grandfather had retained maintained relationships with information brokers, financial analysts, and legal researchers who could provide detailed intelligence about Marcus's background, business activities, and financial situation. Within hours of my request, they had begun compiling a comprehensive profile that would inform my strategic decisions. The preliminary findings were illuminating. Marcus's commercial real estate career had been modestly successful but not exceptional. His income over the past 5 years had averaged approximately $90,000 annually, respectable but hardly sufficient to support the lifestyle he had been maintaining during our courtship. The expensive restaurants, weekend trips, and luxury gifts that had impressed me had been funded through credit cards and personal loans that had left him with substantial debt. His financial desperation was more acute than I had realized. The outstanding balances on his credit cards exceeded $40,000, and he had borrowed against his retirement accounts to fund his pursuit of the apartment he had been renting in San Francisco's Marina District. Consumed nearly half his monthly income, leaving him with limited resources for other expenses. This financial pressure explained the urgency behind his deception. Marcus had not simply seen my inheritance as an opportunity for wealth and luxury. He had viewed it as a solution to his own financial crisis. The 2-year timeline of his deception had coincided with a period of increasing financial strain that had made his successful manipulation of me essential to his personal survival. The psychological profile that emerged from this analysis was that of a man who had convinced himself that his deception was justified by necessity. Marcus had rationalized his manipulation of me as a business transaction rather than a personal betrayal. In his mind, he was providing me with companionship and affection in exchange for financial security, arrangement that benefited both parties. This understanding was crucial for predicting his likely responses to the obstacles he was about to encounter. When Marcus discovered that his access to my inheritance was blocked, he would not simply accept defeat and move on. His financial desperation and psychological investment in the scheme would likely drive him to escalate his efforts, potentially in ways that could become dangerous or destructive. The strategic implications of this assessment were clear. I needed to prepare for a prolonged conflict that might involve multiple legal, financial, and personal dimensions. Marcus's desperation would make him unpredictable and potentially aggressive in his attempts to salvage his position. My response would need to be both defensive and proactive, protecting my interests while also creating consequences that would deter future attempts at manipulation. The professional team that my grandfather had assembled for such situations was already being activated. Harrison Blake was coordinating with forensic accountants who would trace Marcus's financial activities throughout our relationship. Private investigators were documenting his background and current circumstances. Security consultants were assessing potential risks and developing protective protocols. But the most important element of my strategic response would be my own transformation. The naive woman who had been deceived by Marcus's performance would need to become someone capable of managing complex adversarial situations with confidence and skill. This transformation would require not only intellectual understanding, but emotional resilience and strategic thinking capabilities. The process of developing these capabilities began with a systematic review of my own strengths and resources. My education at Stanford had provided me with analytical skills and intellectual confidence. My work with the Whitmore Foundation had given me experience in managing complex projects and working with diverse stakeholders. My social connections included attorneys, business leaders, and other professionals who could provide advice and support. More importantly, I possessed something that Marcus lacked: the moral authority that comes from being the victim of fraud rather than its perpetrator. This position would provide me with advantages in any legal proceedings and would ensure that I had the support of family, friends, and professional advisors who understood the justice of my cause. The financial resources available to me were substantial enough to sustain a prolonged legal battle, if necessary. The trust structure my grandfather had created included provisions for legal expenses and other costs associated with protecting the inheritance. I would not need to make strategic decisions based on financial constraints or concern about the cost of professional representation. The timeline for implementing my response plan was flexible but deliberate. The remaining days of our honeymoon would provide an opportunity to gather additional intelligence about Marcus's plans and reactions while maintaining the facade of normalcy. This information would be crucial for developing more specific tactical approaches once we returned to San Francisco. Upon our return, the full resources of my grandfather's protective system would be deployed. Marcus would discover that his assumptions about his access to my inheritance were completely incorrect. The legal and financial obstacles he would encounter would be both immediate and comprehensive, designed to make his position untenable while providing me with maximum leverage for any negotiations or legal proceeding. The investigation into his background and activities would provide evidence that could be used in potential criminal proceedings if his deception rose to the level of fraud. The civil remedies available through the trust structure would ensure that his attempts at manipulation would result in significant personal consequences. But beyond the specific tactics for dealing with Marcus, I was beginning to understand that this situation represented an opportunity for fundamental personal growth. The skills I would develop in managing this crisis would serve me throughout my life in both personal and professional contexts. The confidence I would gain from successfully defending myself against a sophisticated manipulation would provide a foundation for future success and leadership. The transformation I was experiencing was not just about protecting myself from Marcus's deception. It was about becoming the kind of person who could not be deceived in the future. This process required developing better judgment about people and relationships, stronger boundaries around trust and intimacy, and more sophisticated evaluation skills for assessing potential partners and associates. The motivational framework that emerged from this analysis was both empowering and inspiring. Rather than seeing myself as a victim of Marcus's manipulation, I was beginning to understand that his betrayal had provided me with an opportunity to develop capabilities and insights that would serve me throughout my life. The painful lessons I was learning about deception and manipulation would ultimately make me stronger, more self-aware, and better equipped to build authentic relationships. The woman who had been deceived by Marcus's performance was already beginning to transform into someone who could recognize manipulation, respond to threats with strategic thinking, and use adversity as a catalyst for personal growth. This transformation would not only protect me from future deception, but would also provide me with the skills and confidence necessary to achieve my full potential in all areas of my life. As I concluded my strategic assessment and prepared to rejoin Marcus for lunch, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been absent since his devastating confession. The shock and betrayal I had initially experienced were being replaced by determination and strategic focus. The battle ahead would be challenging, but I was beginning to understand that I possessed both the resources and the capability to emerge victorious. The next phase of my response would require careful execution and unwavering resolve, but I was confident that my grandfather's protections and my own growing strategic capabilities would prove sufficient to deal with whatever challenges Marcus might present. The honeymoon that had begun with his confession of deception would end with my complete preparation for the confrontation that lay ahead. The transformation occurring within me during those final days in Santorini represented far more than strategic planning or emotional recovery. It constituted a fundamental awakening to capabilities and strengths that had remained dormant throughout my life, waiting for circumstances that would demand their emergence. The crisis precipitated by Marcus's betrayal had become the catalyst for discovering the person I was truly meant to become. This awakening began with a profound shift in how I understood my own identity and capability. For 28 years, I had defined myself primarily through relationships and external validation. I was Robert Whitmore's granddaughter, carrying forward his philanthropic legacy through the foundation. I was the dutiful daughter who had met my parents' expectations for academic achievement and social respectability. I had been Marcus's devoted fiancée and, briefly, his loving wife. Each of these roles had provided me with structure and purpose, but they had also limited my understanding of my independent capabilities. I had never been forced to rely entirely on my own judgment to make decisions without external approval or to defend myself against serious threats. The comfortable circumstances of my upbringing had protected me from situations that might have revealed my inner strength. Marcus's deception had shattered this protective framework, forcing me to confront reality without the buffer of trusted relationships or familiar structure. The man I had believed would be my partner in life had revealed himself to be my adversary. The marriage I had thought would provide emotional security had become a source of danger and manipulation. The future I had envisioned had been exposed as an elaborate fiction. This destruction of my assumed reality was initially devastating, but it also created space for something new to emerge. Without the familiar patterns of seeking approval and validation from others, I was forced to develop trust in my own perceptions and judgment. The process was uncomfortable and sometimes frightening, but it was also liberating in ways I had not anticipated. The first manifestation of this awakening was a newfound clarity about my own intuitive ability. As I reflected on my relationship with Marcus, I began to recognize that my subconscious mind had registered numerous warning signs that my conscious mind had dismissed or rationalized away. The subtle inconsistencies in his stories, the calculated nature of his romantic gesture, the way he had steered conversations away from topics that might have revealed his true character. All of these had created a background sense of unease that I had attributed to pre-wedding nerves or personal insecurity. This recognition was both validating and empowering. My intuitive faculties were more sophisticated than I had realized, and my inability to act on their warnings had been due to social conditioning rather than inadequate perception. I had been trained to doubt my own instincts when they conflicted with social expectations or the apparent evidence of my senses. The process of learning to trust my intuition again would be crucial for protecting myself in the future. The second dimension of my awakening involved discovering my capacity for strategic thinking under pressure. The systematic analysis I had conducted of my situation, resources, and options had revealed analytical capabilities that I had never fully utilized. My work with the Whitmore Foundation had involved project management and stakeholder coordination, but it had not required the kind of adversarial strategic planning that my current circumstances demand. The process of developing response plans for Marcus's deception had engaged intellectual faculties that had been underutilized in my previous life. I found myself capable of complex scenario planning, risk assessment, and tactical decision-making that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The crisis had awakened dormant capabilities that I had possessed but never needed to access. This discovery was profoundly motivating. The realization that I possessed untapped intellectual resources provided confidence that I could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. More importantly, it suggested that my potential extended far beyond what I had previously imagined. The comfortable limitations of my previous life had prevented me from discovering what I was truly capable of achieving.
The third aspect of my awakening involved a fundamental shift in my relationship with risk and uncertainty. My previous life had been characterized by careful planning, predictable outcomes, and the security that comes from substantial financial resources and social support. The revelation of Marcus's deception had introduced elements of danger and unpredictability that I had never experienced before. Initially, this uncertainty had been paralyzing. The possibility that the man I had married might escalate his deception into more aggressive or dangerous behavior had created anxiety that interfered with my ability to think clearly or make effective decisions. The realization that I could not predict or control his actions had challenged fundamental assumptions about my safety and security. However, as I developed strategic responses to these uncertainties, I began to understand that my fear of unpredictability had been more limiting than the actual risks I faced. The intellectual and emotional energy I had devoted to avoiding uncertainty had prevented me from developing the flexibility and resilience necessary to thrive in challenging circumstances. This shift in perspective was transformative. Rather than viewing uncertainty as a threat to be avoided, I began to see it as a natural condition that required adaptive responses. The skills I was developing to manage the unpredictable aspects of my situation with Marcus would serve me throughout my life in both personal and professional contexts. The fourth dimension of my awakening involved recognizing the power that comes from moral clarity and righteous anger. The injustice of Marcus's deception had initially left me feeling helpless and victimized. The systematic nature of his manipulation had seemed to demonstrate his superior cunning and my own naivety. However, as I gained perspective on the situation, I began to understand that my position as the victim of fraud provided me with significant advantages. The moral authority that comes from being wronged was a form of power that Marcus could not match or overcome. My cause was just, and this justice would provide me with support from family, friends, and legal professionals who understood the righteousness of my position. This recognition was both empowering and energizing. The anger I felt about Marcus's betrayal was not a sign of weakness, but a source of strength that could fuel sustained effort and unwavering determination. The combination of moral clarity and righteous indignation created a powerful motivational force that would sustain me through whatever challenges lay ahead. The fifth aspect of my awakening involved understanding the difference between vulnerability and strength. My willingness to trust Marcus, to open my heart to him, and to commit my life to our relationship had not been signs of weakness or naivety. They had been expressions of emotional courage and generosity that reflected my capacity for deep connection and meaningful commitment. Marcus's abuse of this trust did not diminish the value of my capacity for emotional investment. Instead, it highlighted the importance of developing better judgment about who deserves such trust and investment. The lesson was not to become more guarded or cynical, but to become more discerning about the character and motivations of potential partners. This understanding was crucial for my long-term emotional recovery. The betrayal I had experienced could have led to a defensive withdrawal from intimate relationships, but I was beginning to see that such withdrawal would represent a victory for Marcus's manipulation, rather than a healthy response to it. The goal was not to become invulnerable but to become more skilled at recognizing authentic character and genuine compatibility. The sixth dimension of my awakening involved recognizing the transformative potential of adversity. The crisis created by Marcus's deception was undoubtedly painful and disruptive, but it was also providing me with opportunities for growth and development that would never have emerged under more comfortable circumstances. The capabilities I was discovering, the insights I was gaining, and the confidence I was developing would serve me throughout my life in ways that extended far beyond my immediate need to deal with Marcus's manipulation. The woman I was becoming through this process was stronger, more self-aware, and more capable than the woman I had been before his betrayal. This realization provided a crucial shift in how I understood my circumstance. Rather than viewing Marcus's deception as a tragedy that had derailed my life, I began to see it as a catalyst for personal transformation that would ultimately enhance my future in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. The seventh aspect of my awakening involved understanding the responsibility that comes with strength and capability. The resources my grandfather had provided, the legal protections he had established, and the personal capabilities I was discovering created obligations that extended beyond my immediate self-interest. The knowledge I was gaining about manipulation and deception, the skills I was developing in strategic thinking and crisis management, and the insights I was acquiring about human psychology and relationship dynamics were not just personal assets, but potential contributions to the broader community of people who might face similar challenges. This understanding began to shape my vision for how I would use my experience once the immediate crisis was resolved. The lessons I was learning could be shared with others through speaking, writing, or direct mentorship. The financial resources at my disposal could be used to support organizations that helped victims of fraud and manipulation. The personal transformation I was experiencing could serve as a model for others who were struggling to recover from similar betrayal. The eighth dimension of my awakening involved recognizing the importance of authentic relationships and genuine community. The isolation I had experienced since Marcus's confession had been painful, but it had also highlighted the value of people who could be trusted to provide honest feedback, emotional support, and practical assistance. My relationship with Harrison Blake, my grandfather's attorney, had demonstrated what authentic professional relationships could accomplish. His immediate responsiveness to my crisis, his careful explanation of my options, and his commitment to protecting my interests had provided a model for how people could work together based on mutual respect and shared value. This recognition would influence how I approached relationships in the future. Rather than seeking validation or entertainment from social connections, I would prioritize depth, authenticity, and mutual support. The quality of my relationships would be more important than their quantity, and I would invest my time and energy in people who demonstrated genuine care for my welfare. As I prepared to leave Santorini and return to San Francisco, I felt a sense of anticipation about the challenges ahead, rather than anxiety about their difficulty. The woman who had arrived on this island as a naive newlywed was departing as someone who understood her own capabilities and was prepared to use them in defense of her interests and values. The awakening I had experienced was not complete. Personal growth is an ongoing process that requires constant attention and effort. However, the foundation had been established for continued development and increasing strength. The crisis that had begun with Marcus's betrayal would end with my emergence as a more capable, confident, and purposeful person than I had ever been before. The morning of our departure from Santorini marked the transition from internal transformation to external action. As I packed my belongings while Marcus made arrangements for our return flights, I finalized the strategic framework that would govern my response to his deception upon our return to San Francisco. The period of analysis and preparation was complete, and the time had arrived to implement the comprehensive plan I had developed. The decision to move from defensive positioning to proactive engagement represented a fundamental shift in how I understood my role in this conflict. Rather than simply protecting myself from Marcus's manipulation, I would actively work to ensure that his deception carried meaningful consequences. This approach would serve both justice and deterrence, demonstrating that sophisticated manipulation would not be tolerated, and creating precedents that might protect others from similar exploitation. The immediate tactical objectives were clear and achievable. Marcus would discover that his assumptions about accessing my inheritance were completely incorrect. The legal obstacles he would encounter would be both immediate and comprehensive, designed to make his position untenable while providing me with maximum leverage for future negotiation. The investigation into his background and activities would provide evidence that could support potential criminal proceedings if his deception constituted fraud under California law. However, the broader strategic objectives extended beyond simply dealing with Marcus's immediate threat. The capabilities I was developing through this crisis would position me to play a more active role in protecting others from similar manipulation. The insights I was gaining about the psychology of deception and the mechanics of sophisticated fraud would inform educational and advocacy efforts that could benefit the broader community. The transformation I was experiencing would also enable me to assume greater leadership responsibilities within the Whitmore Foundation and other organizations where my family's resources could create positive impact. The confidence and strategic thinking skills I was developing would allow me to move beyond the passive role of inherited wealth toward more active engagement in addressing social problems and supporting worthy causes. The professional team team that would execute my response plan had been carefully assembled based on expertise, reputation, and demonstrated commitment to achieving justice for victims of fraud. Harrison Blake would coordinate the legal aspects of the response, ensuring that all protective provisions in my grandfather's will were properly implemented, and that Marcus's actions were thoroughly documented for potential future proceedings. The forensic accounting firm retained by the estate would conduct a comprehensive analysis of Marcus's financial activities throughout our relationship, identifying any patterns of deception or manipulation that might constitute criminal fraud. Their findings would be presented to prosecutors if the evidence warranted criminal charges, and would also support any civil actions that might be necessary to recover damages or prevent future misconduct. The private investigation firm would document Marcus's background, activities, and associations to provide a complete picture of his character and motivation. This information would be crucial for understanding the full scope of his deception and for identifying any accomplices or similar schemes he might have attempted with other targets. The security consulting firm would assess potential risks and develop protective protocols to ensure my safety throughout the confrontation process. While Marcus had not demonstrated any propensity for violence, his financial desperation and the magnitude of his failure might drive him to escalate his behavior in unpredictable ways. The timeline for implementing these actions had been carefully coordinated to maximize effectiveness, while minimizing opportunities for Marcus to interfere with the process. The legal protections would be activated immediately upon our return to San Francisco, before Marcus had any opportunity to attempt accessing my inheritance or taking other actions that might complicate the situation. The investigation and documentation process would begin simultaneously, with priority given to preserving evidence that might be time-sensitive or vulnerable to destruction. The security protocols would be implemented discreetly to avoid alerting Marcus to the scope of the response, while ensuring adequate protection for my safety and privacy. The confrontation with Marcus would be conducted under carefully controlled circumstances that maximized my advantages while minimizing risks. The meeting would take place in Harrison Blake's office, with legal counsel present and security personnel available if needed. The conversation would be recorded to ensure accurate documentation of Marcus's responses and any additional admissions he might make. The specific approach to this confrontation had been designed to leverage the psychological insights I had gained about Marcus's character and motivation. His overconfidence and sense of entitlement would be systematically dismantled through the presentation of evidence about his true situation and the consequences of his action. The goal was not merely to inform him of the legal obstacles he faced, but to demonstrate that his manipulation had been completely unsuccessful, and had instead triggered responses that would make his position far worse than if he had never attempted the deception. The documentation of this confrontation would serve multiple purposes beyond simply managing the immediate crisis. The evidence of Marcus's reactions and responses would provide valuable insights for other professionals who might encounter similar cases of sophisticated relationship fraud. The techniques used to expose his deception could be refined and systematized for broader application in protecting potential victims. The broader educational implications of my experience were substantial. The psychological mechanisms that Marcus had employed were not unique to him, but represented systematic approaches to manipulation that were being used by predators throughout society. The knowledge I was gaining about these tactics could be shared through speaking engagements, written materials, and direct consultation with law enforcement and victim advocacy organizations. The motivational framework that had emerged from my transformation would also be valuable for others who were struggling to recover from similar betrayals. The process of moving from victimization to empowerment, from passive acceptance to active resistance, from isolated vulnerability to strategic strength, could serve as a model for personal development that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of relationship fraud. The financial resources that would be preserved through successful defense of my inheritance could be leveraged to support organizations that assisted victims of fraud and manipulation. The existing structure of the Whitmore Foundation could be expanded to include programs focused on financial literacy, relationship education, and recovery support for people who had experienced sophisticated deception. The personal relationships that would be tested and strengthened through this crisis would provide a foundation for continued growth and development. The people who demonstrated genuine support and loyalty during this difficult period would become trusted advisors and collaborators in future endeavors. The social connections that proved to be shallow or conditional would be identified and appropriately managed. The professional reputation that would emerge from successfully managing this crisis would position me for increased influence and leadership opportunity. The demonstration of strategic thinking, emotional resilience, and effective crisis management would establish credibility that extended beyond my family's financial legacy to encompass personal capabilities and professional competence. The legal precedents that might be established through potential criminal or civil proceedings against Marcus could provide protection for future victims of similar schemes. The documentation of his tactics and the successful prosecution of his deception would create deterrent effects that might discourage others from attempting comparable manipulation. The transition from analysis to action required careful attention to both tactical execution and strategic positioning. Each step in the process would be designed to maximize immediate effectiveness while also contributing to longer-term objectives. The goal was not simply to defeat Marcus's scheme, but to transform the experience into a catalyst for positive change that would benefit both my personal development and the broader community. The psychological preparation for this transition had been thorough and systematic. The emotional volatility that had characterized my initial response to Marcus's confession had been replaced by steady determination and strategic focus. The fear and uncertainty that had initially paralyzed my decision-making had been overcome through careful planning and the development of comprehensive response capabilities. The intellectual framework that would guide my actions had been tested through scenario planning and strategic analysis. The potential challenges and obstacles that might arise during implementation had been anticipated and addressed through contingency planning. The resources and support systems necessary for success had been assembled and prepared for deployment. The motivational foundation that would sustain my efforts throughout the confrontation process had been built on principles of justice, personal growth, and social responsibility. The knowledge that my actions would serve not only my immediate interests, but also broader purposes of education, deterrence, and victim protection provided meaning and purpose that extended beyond personal vindication. As our plane departed from Santorini and began the journey back to San Francisco, I felt a sense of anticipation about the challenges ahead, rather than anxiety about their difficulty. The woman who had arrived on this island as a naive newlywed was returning as someone who understood her own capabilities and was prepared to use them in defense of her interests and values. The confrontation with Marcus would be the first test of the transformation I had undergone, but it would not be the last. The skills and insights I had developed through this crisis would serve me throughout my life in both personal and professional context. The confidence and strategic thinking abilities I had discovered would provide a foundation for continued growth and increasing influence. The decision to act represented more than a response to immediate circumstance. It constituted a fundamental choice about the kind of person I would become and the kind of life I would build. The passive acceptance of others' manipulation and exploitation was no longer compatible with my understanding of my own worth and capability. The journey ahead would require sustained effort, unwavering determination, and continued growth. However, the foundation had been established for success in both the immediate crisis and the broader transformation of my life and influence. The awakening I had experienced would continue to guide my actions and decisions long after the current conflict was resolved. The flight from Santorini to San Francisco provided the final opportunity for preparation before the carefully orchestrated confrontation with Marcus would begin. As we traveled through multiple time zones, I used the extended journey to review my strategic framework one final time and to prepare mentally for the complex sequence of events that would unfold upon our arrival. Marcus remained oblivious to the transformation that had occurred within me during our final days in Greece. His behavior during the flight was consistent with his newfound arrogance following his confession. He spoke casually about investment opportunities he wanted to pursue with my inheritance,
made assumptions about lifestyle changes we would implement, and demonstrated the complete lack of awareness that characterized his entire approach to our relationship. The irony of his confidence was striking. Marcus believed that his confession had secured his position and eliminated any uncertainty about his access to my family's wealth. In reality, his admission had triggered legal protections that would systematically dismantle every assumption he had made about his future prospects. The next few days would reveal the comprehensive nature of his miscalculation. Upon our arrival at San Francisco International Airport, the first phase of my response plan was implemented with precision. While Marcus collected our luggage and arranged transportation to our apartment, I sent a brief text message to Harrison Blake, confirming our return and authorizing the immediate activation of all protective provisions. The legal mechanisms that would reshape Marcus's reality were set in motion before we had even left the airport. The drive to our apartment in Pacific Heights provided the final moments of normalcy before Marcus's world would begin to collapse. He chatted about his plans to schedule meetings with potential business partners and discussed renovation projects he wanted to undertake for our home. The casual way he referred to these plans as certainties, rather than possibilities, revealed the depth of his delusion about his actual position. Our apartment building represented one of the first tangible symbols of the inheritance Marcus believed he could access. The elegant pre-war structure had been purchased by my grandfather decades earlier, and had been renovated to maintain its architectural integrity while incorporating modern amenities. The unit we occupied featured original hardwood floors, restored crown molding, and expansive windows that provided views of the Golden Gate Bridge and San Francisco Bay. Marcus had always been impressed by the apartment's luxury and location, frequently commenting on its value and discussing how we might use it as collateral for business investment. His assumption that marriage had given him ownership rights to the property was representative of his fundamental misunderstanding of the legal structures that governed my inheritance. The evening of our return passed without incident. Marcus was tired from the international travel and retired early, apparently confident that he could begin implementing his plans the following morning. I spent the late evening hours reviewing final details with Harrison Blake via secure communication, ensuring that all elements of the response plan were properly coordinated and ready for execution. The following morning brought the first indication that Marcus's assumptions were incorrect. When he attempted to access what he believed were our joint financial accounts, he discovered that the banking relationships had been restructured overnight. The accounts that had contained my inheritance funds were no longer accessible through the credentials he had been given, and new authentication procedures had been implemented that required my individual authorization. Marcus's initial reaction to this discovery was confusion rather than alarm. He assumed that the changes represented routine security updates or administrative procedures that could be resolved through a simple phone call to the bank. His lack of concern demonstrated how completely he had underestimated the sophistication of the protective measures my grandfather had established. The phone call to the bank provided the first clear indication that Marcus's position had fundamentally changed. The customer service representative informed him that the account access restrictions had been implemented at the request of the estate's legal counsel, and that all inquiries regarding the accounts would need to be directed to Harrison Blake's office. The representative was polite but firm in explaining that no exceptions could be made to this policy. Marcus's demeanor began to shift as he processed this information. The casual confidence that had characterized his behavior since his confession was replaced by a more focused attention to the practical implications of the account restriction. He began to ask more specific questions about the timeline for resolving the access issues and the procedures for restoring his ability to manage what he considered our joint financial resources. The conversation with Harrison Blake's office provided additional clarity about the scope of the changes that had been implemented. The legal assistant who took Marcus's call explained that a comprehensive review of the inheritance structure was underway, and that all interested parties would be contacted when the process was complete. The assistant was professional but offered no specific timeline or detailed explanation of the procedures involved. The deliberate ambiguity of these communications was designed to create uncertainty while preventing Marcus from developing effective countermeasures. The goal was to maintain his cooperation while gradually revealing the extent of his miscalculation. The process needed to be managed carefully to avoid triggering desperate or potentially dangerous response. Marcus's attempts to contact me at the Whitmore Foundation offices were unsuccessful due to my strategic absence from routine activity. I had arranged to work from alternative locations during the initial phase of the confrontation, allowing the legal and investigative processes to proceed without interference while maintaining the appearance of normal business operation. The escalation of Marcus's concern became apparent through his increased frequency of phone calls and messages. The casual tone of his initial communications gave way to more urgent requests for information and assistance. The growing desperation in his voice reflected his dawning realization that his assumptions about his position might be fundamentally incorrect. The formal confrontation was scheduled for the third day following our return from Santorini. The meeting was arranged at Harrison Blake's office in the financial district, with the session timed to occur after the initial investigation had produced preliminary findings about Marcus's background and activity. The controlled environment would ensure that the confrontation proceeded according to plan while providing adequate security and legal protection. The invitation to the meeting was presented to Marcus as a routine estate planning session designed to finalize the inheritance procedures and establish the joint financial management systems he had assumed would be implemented. The misleading characterization of the meeting's purpose was intended to ensure his attendance while preventing him from preparing defenses or developing countermeasures. Marcus's appearance at Harrison Blake's office revealed the psychological impact that 3 days of uncertainty had produced. The confident arrogance that had characterized his behavior since his confession had been replaced by visible anxiety and frustration. His attempts to control the situation through charm and social manipulation were noticeably strained. The meeting began with Harrison Blake's methodical presentation of the legal framework that governed my inheritance. The explanation included detailed information about the protective provisions that had been included in my grandfather's will, the circumstances under which these provisions would be activated, and the consequences that would result from their implementation. Marcus's initial response to this presentation was dismissive skepticism. He questioned the legal validity of the protective provisions and suggested that they could be easily challenged through conventional divorce proceedings. His lack of understanding about the sophistication of the legal structures involved was apparent in his superficial analysis of the situation. The presentation of evidence regarding Marcus's confession and his explicitly stated motivations for marriage provided the foundation for activating the protective provision. The documentation included recordings of his admissions, witness statements, and corroborating evidence that established a clear pattern of deception and manipulation designed to gain access to my inheritance. Marcus's reaction to this evidence was a mixture of anger and panic. He attempted to minimize the significance of his statements and to reframe his confession as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate admission of fraud. His efforts to reinterpret his own words were unconvincing and served only to reinforce the evidence of his deceptive intention. The presentation of the investigative findings regarding Marcus's financial situation and background provided additional context for understanding his motivation. The evidence of his debt, his declining income, and his increasingly desperate financial circumstances explained the urgency behind his deception and the systematic nature of his manipulation. The revelation of the comprehensive investigation that had been conducted into his activities was particularly devastating to Marcus's psychological state. The knowledge that every aspect of his background and behavior had been scrutinized and documented created a sense of exposure and vulnerability that he had not anticipated. The final element of the confrontation involved the presentation of the consequences that would result from the activation of the protective provision. Marcus was informed that his access to my inheritance was permanently blocked, that his financial activities would be subject to ongoing monitoring, and that potential criminal charges were being considered based on the evidence of fraud and manipulation.
The comprehensive nature of these consequences was designed to demonstrate that his deception had not only failed but had actually made his situation significantly worse than if he had never attempted the manipulation. The deterrent effect of these consequences was intended to discourage any future attempts at similar schemes. Marcus's response to the full scope of the consequences was a combination of rage, desperation, and disbelief. His attempts to negotiate or find alternative solutions were firmly rejected, and he was informed that any further attempts at manipulation or coercion would result in additional legal consequences. The conclusion of the meeting established the framework for ongoing proceedings and outlined the procedures that would govern any future interactions between Marcus and the estate. The message was clear that cooperation with the investigation would be considered favorably, while any attempts at obstruction or retaliation would result in severe consequences. The transformation in Marcus's demeanor from confident arrogance to desperate panic provided a powerful demonstration of the effectiveness of strategic preparation and systematic implementation. The careful planning and professional execution of the confrontation had achieved all of its intended objectives while establishing a foundation for continued success in protecting my interests and ensuring appropriate consequences for his deception. The motivational implications of this confrontation were profound. The systematic dismantling of Marcus's scheme demonstrated that sophisticated manipulation could be defeated through careful preparation, strategic thinking, and decisive action. The process had transformed a potentially devastating personal crisis into an opportunity for growth, empowerment, and positive change. The days following the confrontation in Harrison Blake's office revealed the full extent of Marcus's deception and the comprehensive nature of the investigation that had been conducted into his activities. The forensic analysis of his financial records, communication patterns, and social interactions painted a picture of systematic manipulation that extended far beyond what I had initially understood about his scheme. The forensic accounting team had meticulously reconstructed Marcus's financial activities throughout the duration of our relationship. Their findings revealed that his pursuit of me had been even more calculated and strategic than his confession had suggested. The timeline of his expenditures during our courtship demonstrated a deliberate pattern of investment in activities and purchases designed to create the impression of financial success, while concealing his deteriorating economic situation. The expensive restaurants where he had taken me for romantic dinners had been paid for through cash advances on credit cards that were already approaching their limit. The weekend trips to Carmel and Mendocino had been funded through personal loans that he had obtained by misrepresenting his income and employment stability. The engagement ring that I had believed represented his commitment to our future together had been purchased with borrowed money that he had never possessed the means to repay. The sophistication of his financial deception extended to the manipulation of his apparent lifestyle and social status. The luxury apartment in the Marina District that had impressed me and my family had been leased through a complex arrangement that involved providing false information about his income and employment prospects. The lease agreement included personal guarantees that he could not fulfill, creating legal obligations that would become problematic when his scheme failed. His wardrobe, vehicle, and personal possessions had been carefully selected to create the impression of professional success and financial stability. The investigation revealed that many of these items had been obtained through retail financing arrangements that he had entered into without adequate means for repayment. The cumulative effect of these purchases had been to create a facade of prosperity that masked an increasingly desperate financial situation. The communication analysis conducted by the investigative team had uncovered evidence of the systematic research Marcus had conducted into my background, family circumstances, and inheritance prospects. His digital footprint revealed extensive searches for information about my grandfather's business activities, the Whitmore Foundation's operations, and the estimated value of the family estate. The investigation had discovered that Marcus had created detailed profiles of my interests, preferences, and emotional vulnerabilities through careful analysis of my social media activity, public appearances, and conversations with mutual acquaintances. His approach to our relationship had been guided by this intelligence gathering rather than by genuine attraction or compatibility. The evidence revealed that Marcus had consulted with multiple sources about inheritance law and community property regulations in California. His understanding of these legal frameworks had been superficial and incomplete, but his research had provided him with sufficient confidence to proceed with his deception. The investigation had uncovered records of his consultations with attorneys who had unknowingly provided him with general information that he had misapplied to his specific circumstance. The psychological profile that emerged from this comprehensive investigation was that of an individual who had convinced himself that his deception was justified by economic necessity and social inequality. Marcus had rationalized his manipulation as a form of wealth redistribution that would benefit both parties involved. His ability to maintain this self-serving narrative had enabled him to sustain his deception for an extended period without experiencing the guilt or anxiety that might have interfered with his performance. The investigation had also revealed that my situation was not unique in Marcus's experience. The forensic team had discovered evidence of previous relationships where he had employed similar tactics, though none had involved the same level of financial stakes or sustained deception. The pattern of behavior suggested that Marcus's manipulation of me represented an escalation of techniques he had refined through earlier practice. The discovery of these previous relationships was particularly disturbing because it demonstrated that Marcus's deception was not an isolated incident driven by desperation but part of a systematic pattern of exploiting women for financial gain. The investigation had identified at least 3 other women who had been targeted by similar schemes, though the limited financial resources involved in those cases had prevented the relationships from progressing to marriage. The legal implications of these findings were significant. The evidence of a pattern of deceptive behavior strengthened the case for potential criminal charges and provided additional justification for the protective measures that had been implemented. The systematic nature of Marcus's manipulation elevated his actions from simple dishonesty to a more serious form of fraud that warranted aggressive legal response. The investigation had also uncovered evidence of Marcus's increasing desperation as his financial situation deteriorated during the final months of our engagement. His credit card debt had exceeded $50,000, and he had begun borrowing from friends and family members to maintain his lifestyle and continue funding his pursuit of. The pressure of these obligations had accelerated his timeline for marriage, and had contributed to his decision to reveal his true motivations during our honeymoon. The forensic analysis revealed that Marcus had been living beyond his means for over 3 years, with the gap between his income and expenses growing wider each month. His commercial real estate career had been moderately successful, but his earnings had been insufficient to support the lifestyle he had believed necessary to attract and retain my attention. The mathematical impossibility of maintaining his facade indefinitely had created a psychological pressure that had ultimately led to his confession. The investigation had documented the specific techniques Marcus had used to conceal his financial difficulties from me and my family. These included the strategic timing of payments to avoid bounced checks during social occasions, the use of multiple credit cards to distribute debt across various accounts, and the careful management of his credit score to maintain access to additional borrowing capacity. The sophistication of his financial manipulation had extended to the creation of false documentation designed to support his claims of professional success. The investigation had uncovered fabricated pay stubs, altered bank statements, and misleading references from supposed business associates. These documents had been used to support his lease applications, loan requests, and other financial obligations that had enabled him to maintain his deceptive lifestyle. The psychological impact of these revelations was profound. The systematic nature of Marcus's deception had required not only sustained dishonesty but also the creation of an entire fictional identity designed to exploit my emotions and gain access to my inheritance. The level of calculation involved in his manipulation was both impressive and deeply disturbing. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which Marcus had studied my family's history and philanthropic activities to position himself as someone who shared our values and commitment. His apparent interest in the Whitmore Foundation had been based on careful research into the organization's mission and operations, rather than genuine concern for its work. His comments about continuing my grandfather's legacy had been calculated to appeal to my sense of family responsibility and social obligation. The evidence demonstrated that Marcus had identified my emotional vulnerabilities through systematic observation and had crafted his persona specifically to address the psychological needs he had recognized. His apparent understanding of my interests in art, culture, and social justice had been acquired through focused study rather than natural compatibility. The conversations we had shared about books, films, and cultural events had been guided by his preparation rather than spontaneous intellectual connection. The investigation had documented the specific ways Marcus had manipulated social situations to reinforce his deception. His interactions with my friends and family had been carefully planned to create positive impressions while gathering additional intelligence about my background and circumstances. The charm and sophistication he had displayed during social gatherings had been performed rather than authentic expressions of his personality. The forensic team had also analyzed Marcus's behavior during our engagement period to identify the specific techniques he had used to maintain my trust and enthusiasm for our relationship. The investigation revealed that his romantic gestures had been timed to coincide with moments when I might have been inclined to question his motivations or evaluate our compatibility more critically. The comprehensive nature of these findings provided crucial insight into the psychology of sophisticated manipulation and the techniques used by individuals who prey on trust and emotional investment. The knowledge gained through this investigation would be valuable for protecting others from similar schemes and for educating potential victims about the warning signs of systematic deception. The investigation had also revealed the financial and legal consequences that Marcus would face as a result of his failed scheme. The debt he had accumulated in pursuit of my inheritance would remain his responsibility, while the protective measures implemented by my grandfather's estate would ensure that he had no access to the resources he had expected to use for repayment. The legal exposure Marcus faced extended beyond the immediate consequences of his deception. The investigation had uncovered evidence of potential fraud in his financial applications, tax reporting, and business representations that could result in additional civil and criminal liability. The systematic nature of his dishonesty had created multiple venues for legal action that would ensure appropriate consequences for his behavior. The transformation in my understanding of Marcus's character and motivations was complete. The man I had believed I had married existed only in the fictional persona he had created for the purpose of gaining access to my inheritance. The authentic Marcus revealed by the investigation was someone whose entire approach to our relationship had been based on calculation and exploitation rather than genuine affection or compatibility. The motivational implications of these revelations were profound. The systematic dismantling of Marcus's deception demonstrated that sophisticated manipulation could be defeated through careful investigation, strategic planning, and decisive action. The process had transformed a potentially devastating personal crisis into an opportunity for growth, empowerment, and positive change that would benefit not only my own development, but also the broader community of potential victims who might be protected through the lessons learned from this experience. The comprehensive evidence assembled through the investigation into Marcus's deception created a foundation for pursuing multiple avenues of legal redress that would ensure appropriate consequences for his systematic manipulation while establishing precedents that could protect future victims of similar schemes. The legal framework that emerged from this process demonstrated the power of thorough preparation and strategic thinking in transforming personal victimization into systemic change. The criminal referral prepared by Harrison Blake's office presented prosecutors with compelling evidence of multiple felony violations that extended far beyond simple marriage fraud. The systematic nature of Marcus's deception, the substantial financial stakes involved, and the sophisticated techniques he had employed elevated his actions to the level of organized criminal activity that warranted serious legal consequences. The primary criminal charges under consideration included grand theft through false pretenses, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crime. The evidence demonstrated that Marcus had knowingly made false representations about his financial status, employment prospects, and personal intentions, with the specific goal of gaining access to my inheritance through fraudulent marriage. The premeditated nature of his scheme and the substantial monetary value involved met the criteria for felony prosecution under California law. The investigation had also uncovered evidence of tax fraud related to Marcus's underreporting of income and his failure to declare certain financial obligations and credit requests. The forensic accounting analysis revealed patterns of financial misrepresentation that extended beyond his pursuit of my inheritance
to encompass his broader business and personal financial activity. The securities fraud implications of Marcus's scheme were particularly significant, given his professional involvement in commercial real estate transactions. The investigation had revealed that he had misrepresented his financial qualifications and creditworthiness in business dealings that involved substantial third-party investment. The pattern of deception that had characterized his pursuit of May had also infected his professional activities in ways that created additional legal exposure. The civil litigation options available through the protective provisions of my grandfather's estate offered opportunities for financial recovery and deterrent consequences that complemented the criminal proceeding. The trust structure included specific provisions for recovering damages caused by fraudulent attempts to access the inheritance, with penalty calculations designed to ensure that such attempts would result in significant financial loss for the perpetrator. The civil case would seek recovery of all expenses incurred in investigating and responding to Marcus's deception, including legal fees, forensic accounting costs, security services, and other professional expenses. The penalty provisions also included punitive damages, calculated to exceed any potential benefits that Marcus might have derived from his scheme, ensuring that the financial consequences would serve as an effective deterrent to future misconduct. The restraining order provisions included in the protective framework provided immediate protection from potential retaliation or continued harassment while the legal proceedings were pending. The order prohibited Marcus from contacting me directly or indirectly, from approaching my residence or workplace, and from making any public statements about our relationship or the circumstances of our separation. The asset preservation measures implemented through the civil proceedings ensured that Marcus's remaining financial resources would be available to satisfy any judgments that might be obtained against him. The investigation had identified his bank accounts, investment holdings, and other assets that could be subject to seizure if he was found liable for damages related to his deception. The professional licensing implications of Marcus's conduct created additional consequences that would affect his ability to continue working in commercial real estate. The investigation findings were referred to the California Department of Real Estate for review of his professional conduct and potential disciplinary action. The systematic pattern of financial misrepresentation and fraudulent behavior documented in the investigation raised serious questions about his fitness to hold a real estate license. The professional associations and industry organizations where Marcus held memberships were also notified of the investigation findings and the pending legal proceeding. The reputational consequences of his conduct would likely affect his ability to maintain professional relationships and secure future business opportunities, even if he avoided criminal conviction. The broader legal implications of the case extended beyond the immediate consequences for Marcus to encompass potential reforms in how relationship fraud is investigated and prosecuted. The sophisticated techniques that had been used to uncover and document his deception could serve as a model for other cases involving similar forms of systematic manipulation. The collaboration between law enforcement agencies, private investigators, and forensic accountants that had been coordinated through my grandfather's estate planning demonstrated the effectiveness of comprehensive investigative approaches in addressing complex fraud schemes. The procedures and protocols that had been developed for this case could be adapted for use in other situations involving sophisticated deception and manipulation. The victim advocacy organizations that had been consulted during the investigation process expressed interest in using the case as an educational tool for helping other potential victims recognize the warning signs of systematic relation. The psychological analysis of Marcus's techniques and the documentation of his deception patterns would provide valuable insights for training programs and prevention initiatives. The law enforcement training implications of the case were significant, given the relatively limited experience that most investigators had with sophisticated relationship fraud schemes. The evidence preservation techniques, interview protocols, and analytical methods that had been employed in the investigation could be incorporated into training programs for detectives and prosecutors who might encounter similar cases. The legislative implications of the case included potential reforms in inheritance law, marriage fraud statutes, and victim protection measures that could provide enhanced protection for individuals who might be targeted by similar schemes. The specific provisions that my grandfather had included in his estate planning could serve as a model for legislation designed to protect inherited wealth from fraudulent manipulation. The academic research opportunities presented by the case attracted interest from scholars studying the psychology of deception, the sociology of relationship manipulation, and the legal frameworks for addressing sophisticated fraud. The comprehensive documentation of Marcus's techniques and the systematic analysis of his methods provided valuable data for research that could contribute to broader understanding of these phenomena. The media attention that the case generated created opportunities for public education about the risks of relationship fraud and the importance of protective measures for individuals who might be vulnerable to such schemes. The strategic approach to media engagement ensured that the coverage focused on educational content rather than sensationalism, while protecting my privacy and dignity throughout the process. The insurance implications of Marcus's conduct included potential claims against professional liability policies that might have covered some of his fraudulent activity. The investigation had identified several situations where his professional misconduct might have triggered coverage obligations that could provide additional sources of recovery for damages caused by his deception. The international implications of the case emerged from the discovery that Marcus had used offshore financial vehicles and foreign communication services to support some aspects of his deception. The investigation required coordination with international law enforcement agencies and foreign financial institutions to fully trace the scope of his activities and ensure comprehensive evidence preservation. The technology aspects of the investigation revealed the sophisticated digital tools that Marcus had used to research my background, monitor my activities, and coordinate his deception. The forensic analysis of his digital communications and internet activities provided crucial evidence about his motivations and methods, while also demonstrating the importance of cybersecurity measures in protecting against such schemes. The psychological evaluation of Marcus that was conducted as part of the legal proceedings revealed personality traits and behavioral patterns that were consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial tendencies. The professional assessment provided important insights into his motivations and the likelihood of recidivism that would inform sentencing recommendations and protective measures. The financial restitution calculations that were developed for the civil proceedings encompassed not only the direct costs of the investigation and legal response, but also the emotional damages and opportunity costs that resulted from his deception. The comprehensive approach to damages calculation ensured that the financial consequences would reflect the full scope of harm caused by his systematic manipulation. The plea negotiation process that emerged from the criminal proceedings provided an opportunity to secure Marcus's cooperation and identifying other potential victims and providing information about the techniques he had used in previous schemes. The prospect of reduced charges in exchange for full disclosure and cooperation offered a mechanism for maximizing the protective benefits of the legal process. The sentencing recommendations that were developed by the prosecution team emphasized the importance of deterrent consequences that would discourage similar conduct by other potential perpetrators. The systematic nature of Marcus's deception and the substantial harm it had caused warranted significant penalties that would demonstrate the seriousness with which such conduct would be treated by the legal system. The long-term monitoring provisions that were included in the legal settlement ensured that Marcus's future financial activities would be subject to oversight that would prevent him him from engaging in similar schemes. The monitoring requirements included regular reporting obligations and restrictions on certain types of financial transactions that might facilitate future deception. The transformation of my personal crisis into a comprehensive legal and social response demonstrated the power of strategic thinking, professional expertise, and systematic action in addressing sophisticated manipulation and fraud. The consequences that Marcus faced served not only justice in my individual case, but also contributed to broader protective measures that would benefit other potential victims of similar schemes. The legal proceedings against Marcus represented only one dimension of the comprehensive transformation that was occurring in my life during the months following the revelation of his deception. The more profound and ultimately more significant process involved the deep personal healing and psychological reconstruction that would determine not only how I recovered from this betrayal but also how I would approach relationships, trust, and personal growth for the remainder of my life. The therapeutic work that I undertook during this period was unlike anything I had previously experienced. The sophisticated nature of Marcus's manipulation required specialized treatment approaches that addressed not only the immediate trauma of betrayal but also the systematic undermining of my judgment, intuition, and self-trust that had been accomplished through his psychological manipulation techniques. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma specialist who had been recommended by Harrison Blake's office, possessed extensive experience in working with victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation. Her approach to my case was both compassionate and methodical, recognizing that the healing process would require addressing multiple layers of psychological damage while simultaneously building new capabilities for recognizing and resisting similar manipulation in the future. The initial phase of therapy focused on helping me understand the psychological mechanisms that had made Marcus's deception possible. This process involved examining not only his techniques, but also my own vulnerabilities, emotional needs, and behavioral patterns that had been exploited during our relationship. The goal was not to assign blame to myself for being deceived, but to develop a clear understanding of how sophisticated manipulation works and how it can be resisted. The concept of trauma bonding emerged as a crucial element in understanding my psychological response to Marcus's betrayal. Chen explained that the intermittent reinforcement patterns he had employed had created neurological pathways that made his approval and attention particularly powerful reward. The systematic alternation between affection and withdrawal had triggered psychological responses that were designed to increase attachment and dependence. This understanding was both disturbing and liberating. Disturbing because it revealed the extent to which my emotions and responses had been manipulated through calculated psychological techniques. Liberating because it demonstrated that my intense feelings for Marcus had been artificially created rather than naturally developed, making it easier to begin the process of emotional detachment and recovery. The therapeutic work also addressed the shame and self-blame that had initially characterized my response to discovering Marcus's deception. The cultural messages about women's responsibility for relationship success and the stigma associated with being deceived had created additional layers of psychological damage that needed to be addressed alongside the primary trauma of betrayal. Dr. Chen helped me understand that sophisticated manipulation succeeds precisely because it exploits normal human needs for connection, validation, and security. The ability to trust and invest emotionally in relationships represents psychological health rather than naivety or weakness. The problem was not my capacity for trust, but Marcus's systematic abuse of that trust for exploitative purposes. The process of rebuilding self-trust emerged as one of the most challenging aspects of the healing journey. Marcus's manipulation had been designed to undermine my confidence in my own perceptions, judgments, and instincts. The systematic gaslighting he had employed had created persistent self-doubt that interfered with my ability to make decisions and evaluate situations accurately. The therapeutic exercises designed to rebuild intuitive confidence involved practicing attention to subtle emotional and physiological cues that had been suppressed during my relationship with Marcus. The process required learning to distinguish between anxiety based on legitimate concerns and anxiety created by manipulation or external pressure. This distinction was crucial for developing the ability to trust my own perceptions while remaining appropriately cautious about potential threats. The somatic therapy component of my treatment addressed the physical manifestations of trauma that had resulted from prolonged exposure to psychological manipulation.
The chronic stress of maintaining vigilance against potential threats, the physical tension associated with suppressed intuitive warnings, and the autonomic nervous system activation that had characterized my response to Marcus's deception required specialized treatment approaches. The body work involved learning to recognize and release the physical patterns of hypervigilance, muscular tension, and defensive posturing that had become habitual during my relationship with Marcus. The process included breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, and mindfulness techniques designed to restore normal nervous system functioning and reduce the persistent stress response that had been triggered by his manipulation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.